私はただ自分が死んだわけくらい知っておこうと思っただけだ。
If there's a character who personifies loneliness in InuYasha, chances are you're probably thinking of her. Proud, graceful, and gifted with a mind as sharp as her arrows, Kikyo's arc began and ended in death, a reminder that no matter how much you desire someone or something, life will always throw another obstacle towards you regardless of who you are. At the peak of the anime's popularity, at least in the West, reception towards her was on the divisive end. Some classified her as a jealous homewrecker, only acting as the agitator towards InuYasha and Kagome, while the other side viewed her as a sympathetic character who staunchly upheld her loyalties and responsibilities to the end, despite being forced to exist in a reality where she is constantly reminded of her outsider status. I think you know which camp I'm in, judging on the title of this video alone. Hi, I'm Suin. Hello, nice to meet you. A little bit of backstory regarding my relationship with the InuYasha TV series. Like many children who LARPed as their favorite 2D characters during recess in the early 2000s.
I just wrote some great new lyrics to the Digimon theme. Here goes. Digimon, what a great show. It's a great show, I like it. Fly through the air, look at him digivolve. What does he look like, upside down?
This show is one of the gateway anime that was always airing on Canadian television. As a 9-year-old watching a cartoon of a dog-eared creature killing hordes of demons by swinging a giant sword, it's safe to assume that I was enthralled by the unabashed amount of violence. But what brought me back every day to the family CRT TV were the episodes where the fast-paced action took a backseat and dwelled in the quieter moments. Scenes where the music slowed and the characters were calm and letting out their woes to each other. And a lot of those moments just happened to revolve around her. When talking about InuYasha as a whole, some parts of the manga has to be touched upon. Though the TV adaptation has for the most part been faithful to the source material with no big deviations for the plot, there are some minor yet important character changes specifically with Kikyo that should be pointed out. In the anime, she was largely distant, even somewhat aloof, exhibiting the hurt and jealousy she has endured through verbal contempt levied against InuYasha and Kagome. In the manga, while the cold exterior is still present, she showed her compassionate side more through small gestures, which in turn made her feel more personable compared to her animated counterparts. The anime provided more screen time for some one-time characters that in turn allowed Kikyo to bounce off of, or sometimes dedicating 2 entire filler episodes to expand on her relationship with InuYasha and her village pre-Kagome. In other words, the anime tried to expand on her backstory more with the existing material they had, and the manga showcased her gentle side, which could have affected the overall reception of Kikyo to anime-only watchers. Now, which version do I prefer? The answer is the unsatisfying response of both. The anime focused on her conniving and introspective sides more, whereas the manga made sure her character wasn't too overtly impersonal and distant to drive away readers. And to be fair, she hasn't made the most positive impressions when she makes her official debut in the series.
Kaede! お前は私の何だ。血を分けた実の妹ではないのか。その妹が姉の命令を聞けるというのか。お姉様、どけ。
When we're first introduced to Kikyo, we immediately know that she was someone of high rank, or at least shouldered some responsibility compared to the average person. From how she sealed InuYasha to this sacred tree with a single shot, it shows her apt skills in archery despite being mortally wounded. InuYasha's shocked expression before falling into a deep sleep suggests that they knew each other or at least shared some connection. The fact that she carried out said task proves that she prioritized her duties as the protector of the Shikon jewel above everything else. Therefore, she was someone who commanded significant influence and respect. From those short 90 seconds, or panels, that was the image Kikyo had cultivated and continued to retain until her revival. 50 years after her death, her legend persists, further reinforcing the fact that she was revered and admired among her villagers. When she officially enters into the main timeline, the series does a complete 180 on the perception we had of her. No longer the quietly reserved and always in control, we hear scorn and bitter anger in a voice that was completely out of character for her. And it's one of those instances where Kikyo's progression comes into play, from the pure and untouchable to the tainted and, ironically, human. It's only after her revival that we see her firsthand comprehending these intense and complex emotions foreign to her, such as jealousy and worthlessness, and part of her development is rooted on how to handle them. Initially learning through a series of flashbacks from InuYasha's perspective, the appearance of the unwavering and distinguished priestess Kikyo has built up starts to erode and eventually reveal the real her. A deeply unsure and closed-off individual who felt trapped, propping up a facade for the sake of others.
犬夜叉、そこにいるんだろ？降りてこないか？お前と近くで話すのは初めてだな。
それがどうした？
犬夜叉、私がどう見える？人間に見えるか？
何言ってんだてめえ。
私は誰にも弱みを見せない。迷ってはいけない。妖怪につけ込まれるからだ。人間であって人間であってはならないのだ。お前と私は似ている。汎用のお前と。だからお前を殺せなかった。
なんだそら愚痴か。おめえらしくねえな。
やっぱり私らしくないか。
キキョの寂しそうな顔を見て、俺は生まれて初めて悪いことをしたような気分になった。それからというもの、キキョのことばかり考えるようになっていった。キキョはいつも俺のそばに、俺もいつもキキョと一緒に。
Kikyo, prior to meeting InuYasha, lived an unfulfilling, joyless life that also required her to emotionally distance herself in order to retain her spiritual capabilities. Her powers are linked to the safety of her village, and by extension many others, due to the duties of preventing the Shikon jewel from falling into the wrong hands. Essentially, in order to become the perfect protector, she must become a hollow husk of a warrior who, without hesitation, carried out her duties. As such, when Kikyo met InuYasha, someone who was pushed to the fringes of society due to his parentage, developed a fondness for him because at their core, both wanted the same thing, though for different reasons: a desire to belong. That is the foundation of Kikyo and InuYasha's relationship, the need to belong in a society that expects them to meet at a certain level for something that was completely out of their control. They grew close on the basis of being broken characters, developed a fundamental understanding of each other because they could relate to experiences unique to them that no one could fathom. Kikyo wanted to belong in a place where people viewed her as an ordinary woman and not the benevolent protector, while InuYasha, a full-blooded demon out of his desire to command respect and power, after growing up in a life where he was constantly hunted and looked down upon because of his impure bloodline. Which is why when the only person Kikyo thought understood and loved her for who she is betrayed her, it was a devastating turn of events because this is the person who she thought could trust. He brought light to her otherwise joyless life, only to play along and take advantage of her in the end. Or so she thought.
二度と再び巡り合うはずはなかったのに。
Kikyo is a sympathetic character not because she's dead, but because she is a product of the past who no longer has the opportunity to pursue her own happiness. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the story has a good or bad ending, the fate remains the same as her first: death. Her chapter has already closed 50 years ago, kaput. There is no future for her apart from a renewed raison d'etre of settling her score with Naraku. For a short time, Kikyo tried to create a new life for herself, away from the jewel-gathering ruckus to carve a new identity in a different village, and for a minute she succeeded. The children loved her, the people appreciated her medicinal knowledge, and her kindness charmed everyone. But once again, she's pulled back into the remnants of her past, reminded that she will always be the odd one out, and her ties to the jewel will always come back. Kikyo has no home or family she can return to, and except for the clay and dirt vessel that houses her soul, quite literally doesn't belong in the land that she dwells in. She is a walking contradiction. Her very existence confuses InuYasha, as he was supposed to move on from her. However, he now has no choice but to confront his feelings head-on between two characters who represent a significant chapter in his life, while insisting on keeping his connection to his previous life alive. That in turn contrasts greatly to Kikyo's reincarnation Kagome, who came from an ordinary loving family surrounded by friends in the mundaneness and safety that is contemporary Japan. When things go awry, she could always return back to her time. If she needed some additional guidance, she can confide in the comforts and wisdom of her mother. Or if she needed some out-of-context advice, her friends. The big stinger, however, is that Kagome has a sense of belonging and able to connect with others, despite not being someone born from their respective era. Kikyo, however, had no support system and was presumably independent from a young age. Though Kaede is arguably the relative who can fill in that familial bedrock role, she was the much younger one who relied on her elder sister. In other words, the life Kagome has is the one Kikyo yearns for. So when Kagome, the doe-eyed 15-year-old who lacks the struggles and complexities of a harsh life, suddenly bursts onto the scene and begins to heal the emotional scars that InuYasha bore, Kikyo will obviously harbor pangs of jealousy, especially when she views it as losing to a reincarnation, a copy, a lesser version. How dare her man fall for an imitation of me, when the real deal, or at least closest to it, is right here, and he's torn from choosing between us? Who is she to impede on my relationship with him? Kikyo's name, and as a character, has always been remembered for her tragedy and the sorrow that she experienced throughout her short life. Forced to take on the role as the infallible priestess who did no wrong, the decision that ultimately cut her life short from a violent death was born from a single selfish decision. Yes, it's true that her nihilistic soliloquies were at times similar to that of a pretentious 12-year-old discovering atheism for the first time, but the ultimate redeeming factor about her is, at her core, a deeply compassionate woman, because regardless of who InuYasha becomes, she will unconditionally have faith in what he chooses. And that's why Kikyo is my favorite character, because she chooses to look at the everyday actions that makes us who we are, instead of the extraordinary circumstances that others define us as. I completely admit much of my love for this series is clouded by childhood nostalgia. There are plenty of stories that have a more cohesive narrative than InuYasha, but I think in these cases, intention is more important than the end result. When you cut away the juvenile hijinks and the copious amounts of action, this is a story about overcoming the barriers based on superficial differences. Regardless of who you are and how you were brought up, there will always be that one individual who will look past the judgment and see you for who you really are. Ironically, Kikyo is the character who engaged in both while simultaneously being misunderstood and abhorred by a part of the fandom. I mentioned in the beginning of this video about how she was a polarizing figure in the series. When the long-anticipated Final Act anime aired in 2009, the long-standing grudge levied against her lessened, and the audience slowly began to acknowledge her value. By the anime's conclusion, people were finally reminded of the tragedies and suffering Kikyo endured throughout her short life, and was able to fully appreciate for what she did and what her intentions were. And all it took was her dying for the millionth time. Who would have thought?